At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello everyone, it's me Hannah here today with Joe, and I'm so excited for our guest today who is joining us from Manchester, which is where Joe and I both met. So Dr Karenza Moore is a reader in sociology at the School of Geography, Politics and Sociology at Newcastle University. So Karenza has been researching and writing about drugs, rave/dance music cultures and youth leisure for over 20 years. So her work is focused on young people who use drugs, understanding the risks, the harms, the pleasures, the meanings and the motivations of illicit drug use. And I'm so looking forward to Karenza taking us on the journey around dance music culture and drug use, the world of researching after parties, changing drug trends, and her work around safer partying. So really warm welcome to Karenza.
Thank you, Hannah.
So I thought we could kick off with you telling us how you got into the field. What was it that really got you interested in researching drug use in these so-called recreational settings, so raves and nightclubs, as well as with working with youth who take drugs?
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the great introduction, Hannah. So I was just kind of casting my mind back to the first publication that I did around the time that I was doing my PhD. And my PhD was actually about how young people envisage the future of mobile technologies. So while I was doing my PhD, I wasn't actually researching drug use. However, I had been for maybe by then about 10 years, probably more than that actually, involved in dance music scenes around London. And then when I moved to Manchester, we were just discussing what a great clubbing city Manchester is. I kind of got more involved in the club rave and the club scene in Manchester as well, and started thinking, well, actually, why don't I use some of the kind of methods that I've been taught in doing a sociology PhD to look particularly at young people's drug use? And that's kind of where it started. I got to the point where I was publishing about drug use, young people's drug use in particular, about the same number of publications that I was around gender and technology. So there's this other whole side to my work which looks at gender and technologies, and that's kind of where the kind of combination ended up coming from. So I suppose it was a personal journey as well into into what I would call drug studies, or young people's drug use. It was a personal journey, and it was also a kind of professional one, I guess. And also a geographical one, in the sense of moving to Manchester really kind of opened my eyes, I guess, into the possibilities of researching this topic.
And so, Manchester is such a fantastic city, amazing nightlife. And I mean, I can relate as well, being inspired when I moved there, as well, and falling in love with the nightlife there. And I guess we were talking before as well, just off camera, some of the benefits as well of actually being within the scene to be able to conduct that research, which is a bit of a practicality that sometimes people might not even consider, of how important it is to be able to actually be relatable to the group of people that you want to conduct research with.
Yes. I mean, I think this is a really interesting issue. And I know, within social drug research, there's always been a big debate about how much of ourselves we can bring into the research, and particularly when we're publishing or writing up research, presenting findings, how much of ourselves we can bring into that. So we were just saying about how, that's framed as positionality within social sciences. Years and years ago, Fiona Measham and I wrote a paper about what we called reluctant reflexivity. So that's this kind of idea of like you want to be reflexive about your own position within the research, but that given drugs are illegal, ultimately, there's kind of professional, personal, practical risks about being reflective, reflecting on your position in the research, being honest about where you got your respondents from, for example. Part of the ketamine study that I've pretty much just finished, the 3-year study, involved doing a lot of participant observations at techno nights, festivals, and, in the post-pandemic period, that's been kind of 3 years of attending, 30 nights, most recently another 15. So we're on 45 nights, which I do. Yeah, I do structured observations of those nights. So that is literally going as a punter, but still putting my research hat on, and then coming back I've been doing this for years, actually, doing kind of notes. What did I see? What kind of drug effects was I seeing? What was the music like? What was the crowd like? All that kind of stuff. And then kind of keep having that as a form of data
You need a
production,
really
I
good
guess.
memory for that. Do you do that?
I do, yes. Yes, yeah, I do. So, one of the things I do is make, and I've advised my students to do this. My research students to do this is to use your phone to do little voice notes. Little notes to yourself, because obviously phones are widely used now in clubs and at raves, and festivals. So it's become a lot easier to do it since the smartphone, obviously. Yeah, so I think it's like a thorny issue, really, and I've always struggled a little bit with the whole discussion around, positionality, being reflexive about your place in the research. And yeah, it's an ethical challenge, isn't it, I guess?
And I think it's really interesting because as scientists, which is both me and Joe, are both scientists, that's our background. Sometimes it's just not discussed really within undergrad science, or even beyond that sometimes, to really question your position and how your beliefs impact your own research. Because the reality is that for many people, of course, it is going to. But I love how much of your research is really field work taken to a whole new level.
Yes, it is. And I think, again, it's only recently that we've been thinking about after parties, and I know we're going to come on to that. But one of the reasons been working with Lisa Williams on a paper writing about after parties, and one of the things kind of hot off the press, I guess, is saying about how one of the reasons that after parties haven't been studied or published about in the same way that, say, clubs have, is because of that private, behind closed doors aspect of often quite prolonged drug use that goes on at after parties. That's kind of what after parties, there's a kind of key element of after parties is the drug use. People taking stimulants mostly in rave and dance music clubs. And then, of course, not necessarily just going home to bed when the rave is over or the festival's over. I know ravers and clubbers know that how important after parties are to rave and dance music culture, but it's a very kind of neglected area of research. And I guess that's why I think it's sort of important to start thinking about some of the more hidden spaces of drug use that relate to rave and dance music culture. But
Difficult
again,
to do research,
it's even harder to study
at after parties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, they've come up in terms of interviews about all different kinds of drugs over the years. And one of the things about ketamine in particular was, even back in 2008, we published a paper about ketamine as being the most fun you can have for £20. But most that people were talking about their ketamine use in relation to after parties. At that point, most people that we interviewed didn't use ketamine in raves or club spaces. It was all after parties. Now, in the kind of more recent work I've been doing on ketamine, is more of a mix. And although people still do it mostly after parties, it's much more commonly used in more public spaces, in clubs and raves. And I think that's interesting as well, because we're seeing the kind of public, or semi-public anyway, face of ketamine. What is it like when people are having ketamine in public raves or dance club festivals, as opposed to behind closed doors at home, after the party with their mates.
And that's just, why it's so important that you have that research from after parties. Otherwise, you're missing such a big chunk of drug use.
Yeah, what's really interesting, Hannah, there's, think about all the research that's been done on pre-drinking. There's a really interesting aspect of, I think it's fascinating. I remember years ago doing surveys around Lancashire And, there were people saying there that they were having like equivalent of a bottle of wine before they got to the nighttime economy. And that was their pre-drinking. And there's amazing work that's been done from, I guess, sociologists looking at, say, women's getting ready together and how pre-drinking is so much part of that. And, the shots and all that kind of stuff. So there's all this stuff about pre-drinking, a little bit about what's called side loading, sneaking alcohol into clubs. That's another thing. But then there's also, what happens after when people are consuming alcohol. There isn't necessarily that after party kind of action, because people
No,
basically
too
can't keep
tired.
going. Yeah, so I think it's interesting, isn't it? That there's the pre bit as being focused, but for very understandable reasons, I think the after bit is much harder to look at.
No, definitely. I guess just going back to just drug use in general then in nightlife. So at clubs, at raves, at festivals, we often talk about how just entwined dance music and nightlife and clubbing really is. How do you see the two interconnected? And how have you seen that change over the years? Even in my experience of just, I guess, over 10 years now of going out to different types of nightlife, I've seen it change in 10 years. I'm wondering what you've seen over your period of 20 years.
Wow. That's quite a question. I mean, one of the things I sometimes struggle with is if you think about young people's, let's say that, this classic 16 to 24-year-old group that, say, the Office of National Statistics Crime Survey for England and Wales, they focus on that age group, don't they? So obviously that doesn't involve everyone that, underage 16 to 17-year-olds might not be going to licensed spaces. But I think one of the really important things is to think that, I'm going to say this now, most young people, if you think about national general population surveys, don't take drugs. I always say this to my students. I say most young people don't take drugs, and they're like, "Oh no, you're a drugs researcher. Why do you say that?" I say, but they don't. However, if you think about young people's leisure and then start then bringing in their kind of music consumption, and then they're going out, then that is where it becomes much more important. When I say young people don't take drugs, when young people go out in the nighttime economy, most young people do take drugs because still the most popular drug is alcohol. So that's again something that I think is important, that whenever we're talking about illegal drugs at raves or, at nightclubs or bars, done quite a bit of work around drug use in bars, it's the alcohol is always there. So I think that's something important to remember, I guess. That's something that I guess has changed a bit over the years, because one of the things that I've kind of noticed, particularly in the last 10 years, is about young people's alcohol use and how that's declining. And it's not really clear how that decline relates to their consumption of other substances. And I think that is really, really important.
I've certainly noticed the decline in alcohol use in younger people, students and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably like the big headline trend, isn't it? So I think that's kind of interesting. But in terms of in dance music culture, I mean, I always have this idea of kind of emerging trends and enduring trends. So, and I kind of find it helpful to think about those two things happening at the same time. So there's some enduring trends, for example, the popularity of MDMA, ecstasy amongst ravers, and that's just so embedded in the culture that isn't going to change, I don't think, and it might go up and down, but it's not going to change. But then you have others.
That's really interesting. What is it about ecstasy that is so enduring?
Yeah, I mean, it's the effects that people seek from it. And I think what's really interesting, because when the quality of purity of MDMA went down and methadone, for example, MCAT kind of emerged, it was interesting when people were talking about the emergence of MCAT and methadone, and they were saying, oh, it's a little bit like MDMA. They were kind of seeking that, it's a little bit like the stimulant that we all love, but it wasn't. It ultimately wasn't giving people what they wanted. And one of the things I really thought was interesting is, as soon as MDMA, ecstasy, and actually powder cocaine at the time, as soon as the purity of those two substances kind of improved, we're talking like 2010s and then into sort of about 2013, 14, then so many people went back to MDMA, and I think that was interesting. It was almost like people were looking for something that could live up to MDMA ecstasy, but it just kind of didn't work. So I think MDMA ecstasy is so central to dance music scenes. I just can't see that changing. But obviously, poly substance use and poly drug use among young people is the norm when they're in those spaces. So the likelihood is that MDMA ecstasy will probably be just one of the substances that they might be using. Sometimes at the same time, and then sometimes in succession, depending. So yeah, I think that's I suppose the biggest trend over the years have been the kind of rise and fall of binge drinking, which changed kind of rave and club spaces quite a lot, and then the emergence of some novel psychoactive substances like methadone, which were popular for a while, especially amongst young people, not just clubbers, and then the enduring popularity of MDMA ecstasy. And I think now the kind of it's not really emergence because it's always been there, but the place of ketamine in rave dance cultures it's always been there, but the prevalence was quite small. I think it was quite a niche substance. I'm not saying it isn't a niche substance still, but its appeal seems to have widened out a little bit.
So I remember even growing up in Bristol, so we're talking over 10 years ago, there was almost more of a stigma associated with ketamine at the time, and it definitely had more of a negative perception. In fact, it was almost described often as like a dirty drug. But then that shifted very quickly, the perception. It kind of almost became more socially acceptable within young people. And I actually don't really know what drove that change and that change of perception, because it felt like it was almost over a short period of time. In fact, just like a couple of years. I don't know if you have any insights from your work, what caused that shift in quite...
Yeah, okay. There's so many different things we could talk about ketamine, Hannah, but I'm just referring to some of the data that came out of the survey. So we did a ketamine survey of people in the UK and Europe. It's quite an in-depth survey, so it was kind of focused on harm reduction. So particularly interested I was in ketamine's place in dance music culture, and most of the survey was people were recruited from electronic dance music events. So most of the people in the survey are clubbers, although not all, I don't think. But just looking at some of the figures here, so about 75% or so of people in the UK that we surveyed said that they thought ketamine was now an acceptable part of dance music culture. I find that fascinating. Although a lot of them in the written comments said it's very popular, it's very prevalent to their mind. It's popular in friendship groups. I think it was, I said 60 odd % of people said they knew 10 or more people that took ketamine. So it's obviously quite widespread in people's friendship groups. But then people did still say there is some stigma around it, and that they thought that they saw people with problems with ketamine, but that actually because of ketamine not being perceived, it's kind of not being perceived as necessarily a really negative substance, that those problems were a bit hidden, partly related to how quickly you can build up a tolerance as well. So, people that were regularly using was saying that they were concerned about the amount of ketamine, literally like the physical amount of ketamine that they were consuming. And about 25 to 30% of people said they thought it was causing a problem in their social group, because this is kind of recreational, social drug use, but that some people were concerned about friends that were getting really into ket. So I think we could probably all recognise that a little bit. You were saying about why there's quite short.
Yeah, it felt like it was a quick turnaround, and also it was like a quick turnaround of social acceptability. And then there was also the interesting emergence with being discussed, by magazines like Vice, is ketamine ruining dance floors and spaces. So it was almost like you had this acceptability, but then a rejection by some quite high profile DJs at the time as well. So it was like this bizarre situation that it felt like that was happening within the nightlife scene.
Yeah, there's but that's discussion about whether ketamine's suitable for dance floors. When we did the research on ketamine, sort of 2005 and 2005, 2006. So it was made into a Class C substance in 2005. Then in 2016, it was ratcheted up to Class B, so it's now class B. So in 2005-6, when we were looking at ketamine use, and actually we did some interviews of people that were living in Bristol and were part of the mostly free party scene at the time. There's another academic at Bath University who also was looking at ketamine use in the free party scene, and there it was again very negatively perceived. People saying it was ruining the vibe. That was the main thing. So it's kind of interesting for me to see some of those discussions about ketamine ruining the vibe on dance floors kind of happening again. What's interesting, I think, with that is so much depends on dose with ketamine. So there is now a trend of particularly young people taking small amounts of ketamine bumps, which I'm sure you've heard of. So ketamine bumps, and that actually, or they feel from that energy. So there's this kind of juxtaposition between the zombie kind of stereotype, I suppose, of someone that's in a K-hole on the dance floor, which probably isn't the best idea. I've not actually seen that much, to be honest, in observations that I've been doing. More often than not, it's very small amounts which give people a lot of energy for a relatively short amount of time. Again, in the survey, when we were talking to people about why take ketamine, they were actually saying that the fact it's short acting was one of its appeals, and that whilst they liked MDMA and LSD, that it's such a commitment to take a pill or a tab, and that actually ketamine was quite a like easy substance, and have a little bit, and then you could put that to one side. So yeah, I think it depends a lot on the scene. One thing that we've noticed, ketamine is more popular seemingly in harder genres, and that's always been the case. So the harder end of dance music. When we did surveys in 2008, 9, or I can't remember, kind of just 20 around that time, hard trance was really popular and hard house was really popular. Now it's hard techno. Hard techno is really popular amongst young people. I'm sure you know. So, but back then it was hard trance and hard house, and ketamine was more popular in the harder side of the genres as opposed to say like funky house as it was then. So even down, if you can drill down even to the genre, it's not just, ketamine's popular amongst ravers. It depends whether you're like a 40-year-old raver into progressive house or like an 18-year-old into hard techno. So I think that's fascinating that it can be so
Amazing.
finely
And music
differentiated.
can be so linked to the specific drugs that you want to take as well. And actually understanding those perceptions of people who use drugs in those different, very specific music scenes as well. So then you can also adapt the harm reduction as well. So what you're talking about with starting small and explaining that just shows, how the impact of charities like The Loop, that having positive messaging out there, which is really easy for people to implement, it does have an impact on actual drug use. And am I right, you were involved in a harm reduction program, Safer Partying, and was that all focused on ketamine, or was that just
Yeah,
drug use in general?
pretty much. I mean, so I've been doing work with Crew. So they're based in Edinburgh. I don't know if you know the harm reduction service. And prior to that, I was working with Kira, who's part of Crew, and I think quite a lot of people will know Kira as a great harm reductionist. So this kind of came out of the pandemic. So you were saying, Hannah, about how it's so interesting what's happened with ketamine and why has it got more popular. Another thing that Lisa Williams and I are talking about in relation to afters is how during the pandemic, parties at home became the norm in a way. Obviously, they were restricted, and there wasn't necessarily, people weren't having massive. Some people did, but not people weren't really having massive parties. All those ravers and clubbers that couldn't go out, we saw that the use of MDMA drop massively. And I did some work with Release, and we were looking at drug markets and what happened to the MDMA market, and the fall in people purchasing MDMA during the pandemic is kind of fascinating. But I think what happens during that pandemic period, the kind of house parties and being at home and taking drugs at home, and we know this with alcohol, don't we? We know there was a rise in alcohol use during the pandemic as well. Drinking at home, which was already part of a longer term trend towards drinking at home, particularly amongst older people, women in particular. So I think there was something there about the pandemic, and it's been mentioned quite a lot in some of the observations in the survey as well, that ketamine was quite popular. And I think that's kind of, to a certain extent, sort of bled over into when we were, the lockdowns ended. So I'll give you an example. So we did 20 paired interviews, and there was one pair, kind of friends, basically, two friends that talked a lot about how they used ketamine to manage the pandemic experience, but that how then when the restrictions ended, they then had to kind of manage what they did with ketamine now that everyone was going back out. And they talked a little bit about how they would use it more after parties, but they actually ended up using less because they weren't home as much. So I think the pandemic has had quite a big impact on things like perceptions of going out, and in relation to substance use as well. So, I think that's kind of part of it, really. There's these kind of big events.
Has the pandemic changed things permanently, or they've gone back to the way they were?
Well, there's another big question, Jo. I don't know. I mean, I think actually parties at home have always been important. I was thinking, a lot of my students do undergraduate dissertations, and one of my students this year is looking at student parties. And student parties are like, why don't we have more research about student parties? In student houses, if I'm thinking about Manchester, I lived in Fallowfield for 6 months. It was the most bonkers place I'd ever lived in Manchester because it was so noisy. Like students have like what I would call, that's like a rave, basically, open house, open doors, decks, rooms, different drugs. They're really spaces where young people do take substances at home, basically. And I think that's kind of an under-researched area. We very much focus, understandably, on the more spectacular aspects of young people's drug use, which is going to raves and, going to festivals, and I think rightly so. But I do think that we have forgotten a little bit about drug use at home, celebratory kind of social drug use, at home.
And also some of the reasons why people might want to do that. You'd often talk about the pleasures of drug taking as well, and understanding maybe why some students might prefer to have parties at home, and also, the positive effects that they get from that in terms of sociability, bonding.
Friendship groups.
Yeah, friendship groups, which at their age in your early 20s is so, so important. Finding out which music you like, maybe DJing yourself, which most students will know. You have a pandemic of student DJs, which have just come out of everywhere. And so I guess like a different type of space, which I think has, really developed in my since I was a teenager, is the creation of safe spaces. And so when we talk about safe spaces, these are nightclubs or nights that are specifically created, festivals where they're inclusive, welcoming. They explicitly state that they're free from discrimination, harassment, and there's been a real increase in popularity of these, and almost, especially within the queer space, this is like an expectation that a night needs to be a safe space. So just really interested to kind of hear from your perspective how that's developed over the past few years.
I agree. I think this is really fascinating. And I think in part, it's come out of all the great research that we have now around sexual violence in the nighttime economy, that we have around, say, alcohol-related violence in the nighttime economy. As you said, one of the things that I've always been interested in is the influence of queer culture on the rave and club scene. How there's a certain kind of straight washing that goes on. Like, let's just focus on techno, okay? So there's definitely a whitewashing and a straight washing that goes on in terms of the origins of techno and the place of kind of Black and queer people, let's say, in the development of the techno scene. So, there's a whole kind of area there, I think. In relation to safe spaces, I think one of the things I've been writing about recently in relation to queer clubbing is about really these are safer spaces, and that the queer community don't have access to a safe space. There is no space that is entirely safe, but there's so many promoters and clubbers themselves and queer groups trying to build these safer spaces one of the things I think is very difficult for them is to make that promise of being a safe space. And then by doing that, saying there's going to be no discrimination, that's such a high bar to reach, I think, for queer space, for queer space or safer spaces, queer or otherwise. I think I've seen a few queer club nights struggling with this. So, for example, bringing in things like an age limit. So there's a particular queer clubbing brand that I won't mention that's brought in an age limit of over 21 and over. And around this idea that I presume, younger people are maybe somehow not versed with the ways of clubbing and don't really know how to behave when they're out raving and that kind of thing, which I think is a stereotype. But I can kind of see how difficult it is for promoters and for venues and festivals to, so it's like I said, live up to the expectation of it being a safer space. So one of the things I've been looking at recently is about safer spaces for trans clubbers. And, we've had over the last, 5 years or so, and particularly more recently, some horrible denigration of the trans community. I think everyone will be aware of that. And so part of the observations that we've been doing at techno clubs is going out with my partner who's trans, who came out as trans in that period of time, the last 3 years or so, and just observing how people interact with us, how other queer people interact with us, what spaces feel safer, because I think there's always a gap between how people try and create a safe space and then what that actually feels like. So, we've just been observing that and seeing what happens with that. And I think it's been really interesting in the sense that we've found, again, the slightly harder side of clubbing and the slightly younger side of clubbing. And I think this might relate to young people's tendency to be more tolerant nowadays of queerness and of, the anti-racism, that kind of thing. And it seems to be our experience that it's much easier to go to a younger space where there's harder music than go somewhere where there might be, for example, more, older people, straight people, white people. So there's so many things kind of mixed up with this focus on safer spaces. There's some lovely research by Black academic in America, Kemi Adeyemo, who I absolutely love her work. She talks about not just how a space can feel safer, but does it feel right? So you can promote a space being safe or safer, but what does that feel like? Does it feel right for the people attending them? And for, let's say, Black queer clubbers, what feels right might be very different to, your kind of older, I don't know, your trance classics, straight cis white man that goes out. So, I don't want to make it sound like there's loads of divisions on the dance floor, because I don't think there are. But when you do go to clubbing spaces, that crowd has been kind of collated to a certain extent. It's been collated by the promoters and the venue and the marketing and the way that the music is and all that kind of stuff.
And it's on the promoters to actually be asking the people who are attending exactly what you've said, is how does it actually feel in the safe space and does it feel right? And it's hard to know. I think some promoters are really open to engaging with the people that come to their nights or to their parties, because how are you expected to know if you don't ask, or if the research isn't going on? And have you been able to feedback any of your experiences that you've had at any of these parties with your partner to promoters? Are they open to hearing about you?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, on the personal level, they are, I think. So, just as promoters that I know, that kind of thing. And more generally, I think promoters do ask for feedback, maybe at the night, or, when they say, can you report anything that feels uncomfortable? I actually think that quite a lot of clubbers are quite good at doing that. And I've seen that happen quite a bit. The other thing, I guess, around safer spaces is about safer in terms of drug harm reduction. That's really important as well, because that's part of safer spaces, isn't it? It's not just the way that clubbers act, but it's also, what drugs are being taken, what's seen as acceptable or otherwise in terms of things like personal space. So yeah, I think that's important. The other thing about this, the safer spaces, we're talking about public or semi-public spaces, and I think there needs to be, and I think Alex Aldridge just looked at this a bit. There needs to be a discussion about in party spaces. That might be chemset spaces, it might be after party spaces, it might be student parties. That there also needs to be a discussion about what safer space means there as well. It's not just up to the promoters, it's kind of up to everybody that's attending any kind of event to make people feel safe and feel right as well, I think.
Yeah, but people will not go to an unsafe space, will they? So it makes sense for the promoters to know, to keep a really close eye on it.
And so touching on some of the harm reduction and specifically more harm reduction focused around drugs, I know you've done some work looking at the potential regulation of MDMA. Could you tell us a bit more about that and more broadly, if you want to, about harm reduction in general?
Yes. Okay, so the MDMA ecstasy report that I did with the Beckley Foundation, and I have to shout out Hattie, who worked on it with me. It was a labour of love, so we say. But it got out there. So, yeah, I guess, and this is in the similar vein. I'm inspired by Steve Rolls of Transform, who obviously, is the person to go to about regulatory models. Alex Stevens as well. There's so many great people, and we really drew on a lot of that work. So the MDMA report, it was the basic argument was that, I don't think this is going to happen in my lifetime. But the basic argument was there needs to be a legal regulated market for MDMA. There needs to be a legal regulated market for every substance that is currently scheduled or classified as far as we were concerned. We were very much focused on MDMA. I don't like the kind of drug apartheid between, saying, oh, well, cannabis is okay to be decriminalised and legally regulated, but not heroin. Okay, I don't agree with that. Every single substance that's currently scheduled needs to be regulated in a different way. But we did want to look at MDMA as a kind of test case, I guess, or an example of what could be done, partly because of how closely related it is to its use is to rave and dance music cultures. So our argument, I guess, was that you have a group of people who, for the most part, aren't sourcing they're not getting the money for the substances that they want to buy through illegitimate means. That their role of MDMA in rave culture, I guess, is along the lines of the role of alcohol in rock music, for example. The two are so important, they go together. And that MDMA, given it's a relatively low risk, pure forms of MDMA, relatively low risk profile, that it would be an interesting substance to think about how could we do that. So with Beckley and Hattie and I kind of went through the steps that you would have to take. Obviously, the first thing we said was we need to reschedule MDMA so that it can be properly investigated as a therapeutic substance. So that's like the first step. And then we kind of went through thinking about, decriminalisation and then all the way through to legal regulation. But with this idea that, it's not a case of going from one extreme to the other. It's not like, all of a sudden this market will be created and, everything will be fine, because we know that it's not as easy as that. If you look at the experience of cannabis regulation and how it's hard in terms of, black markets that exist in, and, so many different aspects of legal regulation, which are really crucial to think about. But yeah, so that was the focus on MDMA. And I think one of the things that kept me going doing that report was just the stories of, obviously from anyone's child, the stories of parents in particular and friends that had lost people. And this is the same for every drug-related death, but that had lost people. No one goes on a night out raving thinking they're not going to come home. There's still drug-related deaths in relation to that occurring. Recently with been in spaces where that's happened. And I just partly related to the high purity of MDMA and, the strength of pills, I know, which is a concern, currently is a concern. So it just seems like it was right to look at that as a possibility, as a response to the kind of continued drug-related deaths that are related to MDMA and are entirely preventable as far as we're concerned. And I know that's the opinion of a lot of drug researchers, harm reductionists, people in the field, that almost every drug-related death, there could have been something done in the broader context of how prohibition makes all of this so much harder. So, for example, in the ketamine study, I've spoke to young people who say, "Oh, I don't want to go and get help because I don't want to get into trouble." And that seems like a simple thing to talk about. Like, obviously, you don't want to but you can really hear in young people's voices, like they want to be able to sort of feel confident, and they know what to do, and they'll go and ask for help. But you can totally understand if they've just through a lot of searches and to get into the space where they then have a problem, then they're going to be reticent. That's obvious. So
yeah, and this is where universities really need to change their policies. I remember Joe and I talking about this over 3 years ago. It was, in fact, more than 3 years ago now, Joe would have been. And there are consequences for people who are on certain courses. That if you do reach out for help related to drug use, you could be struck off your course, you could be disciplined. And so there is a real fear for people to seek help. And then that's only made worse by having zero tolerance drug policies. And there are now some universities that are trying to, shift away from that and move towards more harm reduction and just rational. We love the word rational at drug science.
Sensible, absolutely life-saving. Yeah, and Manchester has changed its policy from zero tolerance to harm reduction, thankfully, so.
Yeah, and it's fantastic, isn't it? And so much effort has gone into shifting that by so many different groups. I think the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, I think they're fantastic. They've pushed, Anyone's Child's pushed. There's so many different organisations in, drug research and harm reduction space. I've got so much admiration for so many different organisations. Some of Beckley Foundation's work, Release's work around things like inequalities in terms of criminal justice responses to young black men's cannabis use. So many of the kind of inequalities that we see are undertaken through drug laws. I know it seems like an old topic in a way, but stop and search is still an issue.
And it's not, it's a shame. Like, it's unbelievable. It's not an old topic. It should be an old topic, but it has to still be spoken about, because when you're having statistics as shocking as the ones that we see coming out of Release, it still needs to be spoken about. And until we have changes, then people must continue. And we're so grateful that Release are doing their work, and you have Transform and Anyone's Child that are really pushing for change, and then all other smaller organisations as well.
But why? There are so many organisations, and there's so much evidence for, losing prohibition, state regulation. Why? I know you've given evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee, inquiry into drugs, as did I and Dave. So why do you think the governments are so reluctant to change anything? It's so frustrating. I'm sure you've had quite a lot of interactions with MPs, and it's just so frustrating.
Yeah, that was such an interesting experience going to give evidence. It was really, really interesting. I was there with Neve from Release, who was, she's an absolute star. And
you were the first to give evidence, I think, you two.
Yeah, I know. And all I wanted to do was make one point. That was like all I kept thinking in my head, is I just want to make the point that if we ratchet up policy and laws, because most drug users are recreational drug users. The vast majority of drug users use it and related to recreational settings. The smaller proportion of people that have problems with substances, and then other people that do microdosing and other forms of consumption. The one point I kept wanting to get across is if we had the crackdown, as they always say, the crackdown on recreational drug users. Because remember, that was one of the points of looking at the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971, and whether 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act, and is it fit for purpose? That was the remit of the committee, and everyone just went, no, it's not fit for purpose. And actually, I thought that the report that came out of the Home Affairs Select Committee was actually pretty sensible, obviously building on the Black report, and it all made sense. It was like facing, as you said, you like the word rational. It was literally facing an irrational wall, and I don't think it wasn't related to necessarily the people that were on the committee, or it was just the general. Drugs are bad, therefore they're illegal. They're illegal because they're bad because they're illegal. You just go round and round in this circle. And any evidence that we were given, they love statistics, don't they, on these kind of committees? So many statistics that was so well presented. And, I remember Dr Karenza saying about, the racialised policing of young Black and Asian minority ethnic groups in London. And he gave so much fantastic evidence about that. And then, it was like the final response to everybody, there must have been tens, 20 scores of people that said the same thing. And it was like a shutter coming down. So, yeah, I don't know. You just have to keep.
Well, I think what's the other thing that's interesting is that you mentioned this, that the police forces are not, do not want to criminalise recreational drug using. Many police forces.
No. It was interesting. The Labour Party got in, and they're not going to push through what was being suggested of these new penalties for recreational drug use, for taking people's passports away and that kind of thing. I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know how that would have worked, but I don't think but we are still continuing with, stop and search, including it. Not focusing harm reduction, people with dependency issues just going round and round in the system. So, we've not really, it just feels quite frustrating in that sense. Having said that, more positively, as you were talking about, Hannah, there's universities, for example, their places and spaces where we can change people's minds. I've always, whenever I teach about drugs, I'm always very careful to, highlight that, say, the racist roots of prohibition. If you look at prohibition from a kind of social historical point of view, it was basically a race issue used to kind of racialize and criminalize, Black populations when they were emerging from slavery. If you go right back to, so I'm always really keen with my students, and my students are keen on this as well, to try and think bigger picture about why does prohibition exist and why is it so hard to break. And if you look at its roots in racialization, colonial history, it kind of makes more sense as to why we're here and why it's so embedded in our everyday lives. We don't think about it, but if you think about the way that, I don't know, drug raids are portrayed. Do you remember when Boris Johnson was in power and he just went on these drug raids? And, it's
oh, it was weird to see that on social media. And I think that's always so important. I think often when I give talks on drugs, I start off with the war on drugs, because I think you can't really give a talk on drugs without providing that context. And then it helps people understand why we are where we are today. And so, I guess it requires like a whole shake up of the system. That's what people always say, for us to kind of get change. And we can just hope that with time and hopefully with a more progressive society, that things will get better.
But I think what frustrates me is there are countries that are doing so much better. Portugal decriminalised success, and they don't have drug-related deaths, high rates like we have. So that's what really, really frustrates me. We do have, the evidence that it will work, to stop prohibition and the benefits.
Yeah, I think the UK in recent years has gone in the opposite direction to quite a lot of countries. But, there's also the other thing the other thing, when I'm teaching, I talk kind of about the global experience of the war on drugs, because if you think about somewhere like the Philippines, for example, they've had that awful war on drugs and kind of driven by one particular Duterte, the president, and the violence that's involved, that it's often aimed at street homeless populations, at the poorest groups of people in society. And I think we also see that, in the UK, that the people that bear the worst brunt of the harms of prohibition are people that are already disadvantaged in some way, whether they be, poorer people living in disadvantaged communities with drug dependency issues, or whether it's, like young people of colour, for example. So it's always the people that are already marginalised or often experience the war on drugs as a kind of ramping up of that marginalisation or embedding of it. And I think that's really disappointing. One thing I'd like to say about it's great with universities and, a more harm reduction approach by universities, but remember, only, just under half of our young people go to university. We've got all these other young people that don't have that opportunity. And I think that's also important to think about.
Yeah, and I guess that goes back to your work of why it's so important to do research in spaces like after parties and different subsections of nightlife to make sure that you capture all young people. Because again, it's very easy to fall into your bubble when you're at university because you're around students. You forget that there's a whole portion of society. And also, again, you study in a city, people's experiences in the countryside are going to be very different to your experiences in a city. And it's so important that all different types of drug use, wherever you are, whatever little niche you're within or whatever community that you're with, that you're understood, because otherwise, how can we really understand drug use and how to better support people?
Yeah, I've been doing recently from working with some youth studies colleagues. So I was the co-convener of the British Sociological Association Youth Study Group for about 3 years over the pandemic with several colleagues. We've just finished writing a book about researching with young people. So the idea is that, we often do research on young people. They're this kind of sort of a figure almost that we will research. But if we really want to know what's going on in young people's lives, we need to research with them. So that's the idea, that we should do more things more like participatory research or co-production. So that was at the basis of the ketamine study. The idea was that first of all, you've got to go to the spaces. After pandemic, we wanted to go to the spaces anyway, but, go to the spaces where young people spend their leisure time. And that might not be a licensed event. It might be unlicensed, or it might be, in a street or a park or around someone's house. So, trying to think very widely about young people's leisure spaces and going there, which can be hard as you're getting older. And I agree about thinking about where our different groups of young people spending their leisure time. So one of the interesting things about the hard techno scene that I'm now involved in is it's a very young scene, and there's students there, but it's also quite a lot of young working class men and women as well, of all different ethnicities, quite a lot of white people, but and those groups, it's quite hard to reach them in a sense because they're not a university. You can't do, survey. They're quite reluctant sometimes to engage in formal activities like doing survey app in the space. They're not keen on that. So I think that in order to get a really clearer picture of when we say young people, we need to think beyond, some of the methods that we use and think about how can we engage those young people with our research. And like I said, one of the ways that you can do that is, for example, go into the spaces, just talking to them. I've got this kind of idea really about, in youth research, there's what are called walk-in interviews. So the idea is that you kind of go and you walk around the city, and let's say it's a young immigrant or something, and then you talk to them about what spaces are important. So I always had this idea that you could go for like a dancing interview, and you would go to the rave and then dance along and speak to people. That's basically what you're doing when it's an observation, talking to people in toilet queues, all that kind of thing. We not do dancing interviews? I thought that would be great. It might be quite hard if you might get out of breath.
It's good for the cardio, dancing and talking, improve your fitness.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's really important to just go and see what's going on. And I suppose going back to how I got into all this is by going, as a raver, as a clubber, and also as an academic, DJing in those spaces, and just trying to kind of get a feel of the kind of field, I suppose. We've seen this with some of the research. Like Hannah King has done some great work on festival research, and she's written a kind of case study for us about what she calls muddy methods. What methods can we use in these spaces that might be a little bit different to what we're used to using, because they're hard spaces to research, and it's ethically challenging as well, because you're obviously witness to drug use, you might be witness to other behaviours that might be seen by some as problematic. So that kind of adds a little bit extra pizzazz to the issue.
So I know we're coming towards the end, and I just wanted to pick up on the fact that you're a DJ, and I have this theory that there's lots of scientists. So this is specifically more scientists who end up becoming DJs or kind of very mathsy people. But then also, we were talking just before the call, just researchers in general as well have this massive interest in music. Is it the interest in researching for new songs, for new records, understanding the history of it? What do you think draws so many people from that background as well into music? I don't know if you've seen that within like your friendship group.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about scientists and people that are kind of confident with technical.
Yeah.
How can you put it? Like kind of confidence with technical equipment or software. I mean, I think
sound engineers.
Yeah, music production is the other one. You have to be. I've got no music production experience because you have to be good. You have to be good with computers basically and software. And I think maybe that's part of it. And people are comfortable with digital technologies. I think one of the other interesting thing is around gender. And if you think about who the promoters are, who most DJs are, well, they're mostly men. And, that's something that we kind of need to reflect on. I think it's interesting in some genres of music, there's more preponderance of women. And there's also some great kind of collectives, female collectives of DJs, which I think's interesting. So as a woman who can mix, that's seen as quite an unusual, unbelievably seen as quite an unusual thing. I think the reason that people that with maybe science and academic backgrounds is there's a couple of things. It costs quite a bit of money to be a raver and a clubber and a DJ. That's something else. We were just talking about social class really there, weren't we? About working class young ravers and students, and this is all social class is all kind of mixed up with that, as is income, mobility. Can you afford to go to? We were at Greenfields Festival at the weekend for one day. It was £70. It cost us £70 in a taxi to get there and £70 to get back. So the amount of money you can spend is crazy.
Completely. You've got some amazing festivals now. So one that I've just been to, Field Manoeuvres, that do act like tiered tickets, so to enable access. And so you have got some people and promoters within the space now trying to break down some of those issues that you have, because of course music is no different to other sectors in terms of having the mobility of people to be able to access it and to move through if you haven't got the support networks as well.
One of the, just going back to the safer spaces, there's a promoter actually that offers transgender people taxi. So if you want to go to the club, but you don't want to go on public transport, because obviously if you're coming out, you're highly visible, and we know that there's been a lot of transphobic violence recently. So they say, okay, so contact us and we can pay for a taxi to and from the venue. Not all promoters can do that. We've got a bit of money behind them, but I thought that's such a really nice practical
things that clubs can implement, and also just opens up the conversation as well. And hopefully, promoters can share best practices with each other. not to make it sound too technical, but just telling each other what works and what doesn't work. And again, that goes back to listening to the crowd, to the people who come to your nights. And so, I mean, I've really enjoyed this conversation so much. But is there anything else you'd like to share, or is there anything you'd like to flag for people to be able to access more of your research online?
Yeah, well, I have obviously you can go and get through the usual channels, but I have a website called clubresearch.org, and most of my work is up there. The other thing that's up there, which I sent you guys, is our new ketamine harm reduction resource. It's like a kind of double-sided flyer that we developed with crew and with young people at various different techno raves over the last few years. So that's a kind of, I guess it was called a co-produced resource. So if anyone's interested in getting a free ketamine harm reduction digital resource, then you can just go on Club Research, or on my Insta, actually, it's all up there as well.
Yeah.
Amazing. We'll put it in the show notes for sure. Oh, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us on the Drug Science podcast. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah, it's been amazing. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.